the silent general. In the marble halls of ancient Rome, where senators wielded words like weapons and orators commanded armies with their eloquence, there lived a truth that would save an empire from its greatest crisis. In a world drunk on speeches and proclamations, the man who speaks least often speaks most powerfully. For when every tongue wags with empty promises and hollow boasts, silence becomes the rarest and most valuable currency of all. The year was 168 AD, and the Roman Empire stood at the precipice of disaster. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, had entrusted the defense of the northern frontier to his most capable generals. But barbarian tribes pressed against the borders like a tide that threatened to drown civilization itself. In the war council chambers of Vindobona, where the fate of Rome was decided by committee, one man understood that the greatest victories were won not by those who promised the most, but by those who delivered more than they ever claimed they could. General Lucius Valerius Maximus sat in the corner of the great hall, his weathered hands folded across his chest, watching as his colleagues painted grand pictures of triumph with their words. At 52, he was neither the youngest nor the most politically connected officer in the emperor's service. But he possessed something that had become increasingly rare in the corridors of Roman power: the wisdom to let his actions speak louder than his voice. Around the long marble table, decorated with maps of Germania and Dacia, the other generals competed to present the most ambitious strategies, each trying to outdo the others with promises of swift victories and glorious conquests. They spoke of crushing the barbarian coalition in a single decisive campaign, of expanding Roman territory beyond the Danube, of victories that would echo through history like those of Caesar and Pompey. General Cassius Antonius, a young patrician whose family had purchased his commission, gestured dramatically at the map spread before them. "Give me 3 legions and 2 months," he declared, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never seen real combat. "And I will bring you the heads of every tribal chieftain from the Rhine to the Black Sea." Murmurs of approval rippled through the chamber. Several senior officers nodded appreciatively at the young man's boldness, while scribes dutifully recorded his proclamation for the dispatches that would be sent back to Rome. Marcus Flavius Decimus, a veteran of the British campaigns, stood to present his own proposal. "The barbarians respect only strength," he announced, pounding his fist on the table for emphasis. "I propose we march directly into their heartland, burn their villages, and show them the true meaning of Roman power. 6 months, 4 legions, and the entire frontier will be pacified permanently." Again, the assembly buzzed with excitement. Here was the kind of decisive action that senators loved to hear about, the sort of bold strategy that looked impressive in official reports and made careers in the political machinery of Rome. One by one, the generals presented their visions of conquest, each more grandiose than the last. They spoke of auxiliary troops they would recruit, of fortifications they would build, of territories they would claim in the name of the emperor. The air grew thick with promises and projections, with timelines that grew shorter and boasts that grew bolder with each presentation. Through it all, Lucius remained silent. His silence was not born of uncertainty or lack of ideas. In his 30 years of military service, he had fought in Britannia, served in Egypt, commanded forces in Syria, and spent the last 5 years learning every detail of the Germanic tribes that now threatened Rome's borders. He knew their seasonal patterns, their internal rivalries, their strengths and their critical weaknesses. More importantly, he understood something his colleagues seemed to have forgotten: that wars were won in reality, not in rhetoric. When the last general had finished his presentation and the room fell quiet, all eyes turned expectantly to Lucius. As one of the most experienced commanders present, his voice carried weight that transcended political connections or family influence. The assembled officers waited for him to match or exceed the ambitious promises they had just heard. Instead, he stood slowly, straightened his red cloak, and spoke just 4 words. "It will be difficult." The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet that had greeted the other presentations, but the uncomfortable hush of men who had expected a speech and received only truth. Several officers exchanged glances, wondering if the older general would elaborate on his stark assessment. He did not. "Difficult how?" prompted General Antonius, clearly frustrated by the lack of detail. "Surely you have some strategy to propose, some plan of action?" Lucius looked at the young patrician with the calm gaze of a man who had seen enough battlefields to know the difference between planning for war and planning for applause. "The barbarians are better organized than our scouts report," he said simply. "They have learned from our previous campaigns. They will not fight us where we are strong." "Then where will they fight us?" asked another officer. "Where we are weak," Lucius replied. "When we are weak. How we least expect." The frustration in the room was palpable. These men had come expecting detailed battle plans, troop movements, supply schedules, and victory timelines. Instead, they were receiving what sounded like pessimistic observations from a general who seemed to have lost his taste for conquest. What they did not understand was that Lucius had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. But his preparations had been guided by a principle that ran counter to everything Roman military culture taught. He had planned not for the campaign he wanted to fight, but for the campaign his enemies would force him to fight. While his colleagues had been studying maps and calculating optimal troop ratios, Lucius had been quietly cultivating relationships with Germanic merchants who traded across tribal boundaries. Through careful questioning disguised as casual conversation, he had learned that the barbarian coalition was far more sophisticated than Roman intelligence suggested. They had developed new tactics specifically designed to neutralize Rome's traditional advantages in open warfare. And they had stockpiled supplies for a campaign that could last not months, but years. More critically, Lucius had discovered that the barbarian leaders were counting on Roman arrogance to work in their favor. They expected Roman generals to make bold proclamations, commit to unrealistic timelines, and launch the kind of direct assaults that had worked against less organized enemies but would prove disastrous against opponents who had spent years studying Roman tactics. In essence, every ambitious promise made in that war council chamber was playing directly into the barbarians' strategic plan. But Lucius understood that explaining this reality would not change minds that were already committed to their grandiose visions. Instead, he had chosen a different approach. He would let his colleagues pursue their glorious campaigns while he quietly prepared for the war that was actually coming. General Valerius, the senior commander, Marcus Calpurnius, addressed him formally. The emperor expects decisive action from his generals. Your caution, while perhaps prudent, does not address the urgency of our situation. No, Lucius agreed quietly. It does not. The meeting concluded with assignments that reflected the confidence expressed in the various presentations. General Antonius received command of the eastern approach, with orders to crush the Germanic tribes within 60 days. General Decimus was given authority over the central campaign, with a mandate to establish permanent Roman settlements beyond the Danube by the end of the campaign season. Lucius was assigned to what amounted to a supporting role, maintaining supply lines and providing backup for the main assaults. On the surface, it appeared to be a relegation, a sign that his cautious approach had cost him the opportunity for glory. His colleagues offered him sympathetic looks as they filed out of the chamber, already discussing the celebrations they would hold when their victories were complete. But Lucius had received exactly the assignment he had hoped for. Over the following weeks, as the other generals marshaled their forces and made final preparations for their bold offensives, Lucius quietly set about tasks that seemed almost mundane by comparison. He reinforced supply depots, established communication networks between outposts, and drilled his troops in defensive formations rather than assault tactics. To outside observers, his preparations looked like those of a general who expected to spend the campaign in the rear, supporting the real warriors who would win the war. His soldiers grumbled about the endless fortification work and the tedious logistics exercises, wondering why they weren't training for the glorious battles that awaited the other legions. What none of them realized was that Lucius was preparing for a completely different conflict than the one being planned in the official strategy sessions. The first sign that reality would not match expectations came just 3 weeks into the campaign season. General Antonius, who had promised to crush the eastern tribes within 60 days, sent an urgent dispatch requesting reinforcements after his advance units encountered fierce resistance from barbarian forces that seemed to anticipate his every move. The message was carefully worded to avoid admitting failure, but experienced officers could read between the lines. The tactical repositioning described in the dispatch was a retreat, and the unexpectedly coordinated enemy response meant that the barbarians had outfought Roman legions in direct combat. General Decimus's campaign fared no better. His plan to establish permanent settlements collapsed when barbarian raiders destroyed his supply convoys with surgical precision, leaving his forces isolated and undersupplied in hostile territory. His subsequent request for logistical support was essentially an admission that his grand strategy had become a rescue operation. As reports of setbacks filtered back to Vindobona, the mood in the command center shifted from confident anticipation to nervous concern. The barbarians were not behaving according to Roman expectations, and the bold strategies that had seemed so promising in the marble halls were proving inadequate against enemies who refused to cooperate with Roman tactical assumptions. Through it all, Lucius continued his seemingly humble work of maintaining supply lines and coordinating defensive positions. His messages to headquarters were brief and factual, containing none of the dramatic language that had characterized his colleagues' early reports. He described positions held, supplies delivered, and communications maintained without embellishment or interpretation. But buried within those mundane reports were the building blocks of victory. While other commanders had been forced to request emergency supplies and reinforcements, Lucius's forces remained fully provisioned. While communication breakdowns plagued the main offensives, his network of messengers and signal stations continued to function flawlessly. Most importantly, while the barbarians seemed to know exactly where and when to strike against the other Roman forces, they appeared to be largely ignoring Lucius's less threatening positions. This was no accident. Through his merchant contacts and careful intelligence work, Lucius had identified the barbarian strategy from the beginning. They planned to let Roman arrogance defeat itself by allowing the most aggressive Roman commanders to advance deep into hostile territory, then cutting their supply lines and isolating their forces. the barbarians could force the mighty Roman legions to fight at a severe disadvantage. But this strategy required the barbarians to concentrate their forces against the main Roman thrusts, leaving their own supply lines and communication networks vulnerable to a patient enemy who wasn't trying to win glory, but simply to win. The turning point came in the 7th week of the campaign, when Lucius finally acted on the intelligence he had been quietly gathering for months. While the barbarian forces were engaged in their coordinated assault on General Decimus's isolated legions, Lucius launched a series of small, precise strikes against Germanic supply depots and command posts. These were not the grand battles that Roman historians would write epic poems about, but they were devastatingly effective. Each target had been carefully selected based on intelligence gathered over months of patient observation. Each strike was conducted by small, mobile units that could attack and withdraw before barbarian forces could respond. Most importantly, each success was reported back to headquarters in the same understated language Lucius had been using all along. His dispatches described objectives secured and positions improved without any of the triumphant language that had characterized earlier Roman communications. But the cumulative effect of these modest successes was anything but modest. Within 2 weeks, the barbarian coalition began to fracture as supply shortages and communication breakdowns undermined their coordinated strategy. Tribal leaders who had been united in their opposition to Rome began to turn on each other as resources became scarce and victories turned into stalemates. The Germanic forces that had seemed so formidable when fighting on their own terms suddenly found themselves vulnerable when their carefully planned strategy began to unravel. Without the supplies and coordination that had made their initial successes possible, they reverted to the kind of disorganized tribal warfare that Roman legions were specifically designed to defeat. Generals Antonius and Decimus, whose forces had been on the verge of disaster just days earlier, suddenly found themselves facing enemies who were retreating in confusion rather than advancing with purpose. Their subsequent reports to Rome described these developments as vindication of their original strategies, proof that Roman determination had finally overwhelmed barbarian resistance. But the officers who had witnessed the entire campaign understood what had actually happened. While the ambitious generals had been making speeches and promises, Lucius had been quietly winning the war. The official victory celebrations in Rome focused on the dramatic reversals that had saved the northern frontier from barbarian conquest. Senators praised the boldness of Roman strategy and the courage of Roman commanders who had refused to accept defeat. General Antonius received a triumph for his successful eastern campaign, while General Decimus was honored for his strategic penetration of Germanic territory. Lucius received a brief mention in the official dispatches as a competent supply officer whose logistical support contributed to the overall success of the campaign. He could not have been more pleased with the recognition. Years later, when military historians studied the Germanic campaigns, they would struggle to understand how Roman forces had achieved such a complete victory after suffering such initial setbacks. The official record spoke of barbarian collapse and Roman determination, but the actual mechanics of victory remained obscure. Only Lucius truly understood what had happened, and he never felt compelled to enlighten anyone else. When younger officers would approach him for advice on military strategy, he would tell them about the importance of preparation, intelligence gathering, and understanding one's enemies. But when they pressed him for details about his own successes, he would simply smile and change the subject. The best victories, he would say, are the ones that look easy in hindsight. In our modern world of social media and constant communication, This ancient wisdom might seem counterintuitive. We live in an age where visibility is often mistaken for competence, where the loudest voices are assumed to be the most knowledgeable, and where success is measured as much by announcement as by achievement. But the principle that guided Lucius remains as relevant today as it was in the marble halls of Rome. In any competitive environment, those who promise least and deliver most will ultimately prove more valuable than those who promise most and deliver least. The most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, and professionals understand that credibility is built not through grand proclamations, but through consistent results that exceed expectations. They know that while others are busy explaining what they plan to accomplish, the wise person is quietly accomplishing more than they ever claimed they would. This doesn't mean being secretive or modest to a fault, but rather understanding that words are abundant while results are rare, that predictions are easy while performance is difficult, and that in a world full of noise, the person who speaks only when they have something meaningful to say will find their voice carries the weight that others cannot.